We all inherit weird habits and traits from our parents. One of the weird habits that I have inherited, or I guess learned from my mom, is to save back and just met out just a tiny little bit, a little bit at a time of things that are really special, things that are really delicious, especially food, things that are a luxury instead of just enjoying them all at once. And the problem with doing this, with saving back little bits so as not to run out of whatever special treat you have, whether it's Halloween candy or a particularly good bottle of vinegar or olive oil, is that eventually food stuff does not last forever. Eventually it's going to be spoiled, and you actually got to enjoy less of that thing that you were trying to save and to savor. And I think that's part of the lesson in the Bible verse that we read today from Matthew 25, verses 14 through 30, is that holding back, hoarding little bits of what we have, really is a waste. It's a waste because we don't get to enjoy it. It's a waste because it's not put to good use. It's a waste because we don't help or bless other people with that thing that we love or that thing that we have or thing that's been given to us. And actually, if we look at other places in the Bible, we can see that the idea of hoarding, of holding stuff back for ourselves, is sort of universally condemned as a bad thing to do. We're not supposed to hold on to more than we need. We're supposed to share what we have. And in the book of Acts even, this couple, Ananias and Sapphira, who are part of the early church, they try to hold back a little bit of their money just to make sure that they're safe. They try to hoard a little bit of their wealth instead of giving all of it to that early church that's holding all things in common. And what happens to them is they fall on the floor dead. So we know from our scriptural tradition that holding on too tight to the things that we have, hoarding what we've been given instead of putting it out in the world, instead of using it, enjoying it, blessing others with it, that's not what we're called to do. That's not why we're given what we're given. We are meant to put to good use what we have been blessed with. And I hate when people use the hashtag blessed just all over the place for silly things, but here I'm using the word blessed intentionally. Because part of that putting to good use what we have is realizing that we didn't make it on our own. We didn't cause the good things we have in life to happen to us without help from others and without the provision and the loving kindness and the faithfulness of God. And so part of what we do with what we have has to be faithfulness to that reality, that we are blessed by God's abundance, by God's provision, by God's love in this world. Now, in our Methodist tradition, John Wesley says, to earn all you can, to save all you can, and to give all you can. So it's even particularly Methodist for us to start to think about how we can not just work hard and be frugal, but also how we can start to practice generosity instead of practicing holding what we have back, keeping things for ourselves. So I'm guessing that this is probably none of it news for you. You have probably heard sermons on financial generosity before. You have probably heard preachers talk about money and giving money away, and understanding that it's really not entirely ours to begin with. So I'm guessing that knowing that we should practice financial generosity, know that we should practice giving, is probably not the issue for most of us. We've heard that before. But I'm guessing that if you're still struggling with financial generosity, if it still is a little bit scary and a little bit risky for you, that the thing that's standing in your way is probably more about the motivation and even about the real practical, on-the-ground parts of generosity, making it truly a practice. And so it's those two things that I want to focus on today, our motivation and the practical issues around a life of financial generosity. Now, so this passage, this parable of the talents that it's normally called, when we hear the word talent in our time, we also think of talents as things like that you're musical, or that you have a gift for organization, or that you're a great public speaker. These sort of intangible things that are blessings that are given to us that maybe we have cultivated, but that are somewhat innate for us too. Now, I have heard it said that this word talent actually, in referring to those intangible things, came from an understanding of this parable, and that the way that God blesses and gives people things. And so the word talent became interchangeable with an intangible personality, gift, or skill. And before we get into the money part of this, I want to say that we absolutely should use our talents for loving and serving others, for loving and serving our churches and our faith communities. We are called to do that 100%. And the way we're asked to use our intangible talents, the personality gifts and the skills that we have, may not be related to what our profession is. It may be something that, like, you are incredibly organized, and there are ways that the church can have you serve through that gift of organization. One of the ones we see on display almost every single week is people's talent for music, whether they're a professional musician or not. So I want to challenge you in this season of stewardship, before we get into talking about the money, that if you have a talent that you want to put to use, whether it's related to what you do professionally or not, it may not be a skill that you can make money off of at all, but I believe that we're called to use those for the church. And so that's going to be part of our pledging this year too, is how we can use those intangible gifts and skills and talents that we have. Now, with all of that said, this parable that Jesus is talking about, these servants and this landowner, he is talking about money specifically. He's not talking about intangible gifts or skills that these servants have. He is talking about a very large sum of money that has been given freely to these servants. And Jesus talks about money quite a bit in the Gospels, by the way. And the reason for that is that how we use our money, our relationship to it, has a huge effect on us in virtually all aspects of our lives, especially our spiritual lives. And so that's why we need to understand that the practice of financial generosity is a spiritual discipline. It's not something that is divorced from our spirituality. It's not a thing that we need to set aside over here from our spiritual lives. It is intimately related with our relationship with God, with our relationship with others. And it is a thing that we need to put into practice as part of our effort to grow closer to God. And beyond even all of that, I think financial generosity maybe is the hardest spiritual discipline. And the reason for that is that, if you're trying to take up a spiritual discipline like prayer, that's about making time in your day to add something. Financial generosity is about figuring out what you can do without in the rest of your life. What's a thing you're ready to sacrifice and to replace with financial generosity? To say that this spiritual discipline of generosity is more important than something else that's already a habit for you. The way that we manage our finances is a statement of our priorities. It's a statement about what we care the most about. It's a statement about what we believe is possible in this world, through our churches, and in our own lives and our own relationships with God. And it's also about how much we trust God in our lives. Now, I am not a prosperity gospel preacher. I'm not saying that if you are incredibly faithful, God is going to financially bless you, that you're going to become someone who's wealthy. But I do believe that God provides for us. God provides for us in ways that sometimes we don't quite understand in ways that we're not looking for. And sometimes that provision is through communities. It's through churches. One of the things that I've seen here at Oconee Street about the budgeting process is that it really is a statement of our priorities. That idea that how we use our money says a lot about what we believe, I think that is already happening here. Because the way that budgeting happens here is not about what we expect to receive. And so, this is the amount of money we took in last year, and so that's what we're going to be able to do this year, which is, by the way, in church world, a recipe for your church continuing to do less and less and less. Instead, what happens here at Oconee Street is that we start with what we want to do, what ministry is needed, what the vision and the mission is for the year to come. And we enter into that faithfully and then expect that God is going to provide for the mission and the ministry that needs to happen here, not just internally, but in the community around us. Now, I want to go back to our Bible verse for a minute, our Bible story for a minute. And the end of this is uncomfortable. We're talking about that God is a God of provision, that God is a God of blessing, that these servants are blessed. But then there's this really negative reaction with the last servant who isn't faithful with what he's given. Now, if I had to guess about why this servant gets busted about hiding the talent, I think it's because he's showing what he believes about his master, about God, in that moment. He believes, and he is stating, that his master is dishonest and is punitive. And that this servant, instead of living in an expectation that God is who God says God is, that God is a God of provision and love and abundance, instead, this servant is living in a mindset of scarcity. And honestly, a lot of Christians think that way without realizing that they do it. And they believe that they have to hold on to every penny that they have because punishment in the form of poverty is just around the corner. Now, we know that poverty is not God's punishment for anything, and that we are called as Christians to lift up and to love who is poor. That God even has a preferential love for the poor. And so a mindset of scarcity, a mindset of a lack of generosity is not rooted in grace. It's not rooted in a knowledge of a loving a loving God worthy of trust. It's rooted in waiting to fall, waiting for judgment. And so when we practice financial generosity, it helps us, even if we're not spiritually there yet, it helps us to move out of that mindset of scarcity. It helps us to move away from the ways that maybe unconsciously we're afraid. We're afraid that God isn't actually going to be there. And instead, it helps us to rely on this understanding that God is going to take care of us, that God is going to provide for us, that God's love and grace are sufficient, and that the community of believers is living in to that understanding of who God is. And so financial generosity is not just about supporting a church. It's about changing how we believe. And it's about showing other people what we believe about who God is, about the abundance of God's provision. And it's not about the exchange of services for money, which is how most people think, but it's about understanding that we are investing in building God's kingdom, building a world that is abundant and has abundant care and abundant grace and abundant love for each and every person. So that's the spiritual stuff. But what about the practical side of developing financial generosity as a spiritual discipline? So I want to just give you 3 quick pieces of advice to start making this practice part of your spiritual life. So you've got the understanding of the why now. This is the how. So first off, when we talk about financial generosity, we always say that we talk about tithes, and tithes are 10% to your faith community. So not 10% in general to charity, but 10% to your faith community. That's a tithe. But a tithe is our goal. And certainly if we reach that goal, we can continue enhancing our generosity beyond 10%. But if you have never practiced financial generosity before with your church, and 10% sounds undoable, that's okay. The thing I'm always going to say about spiritual disciplines is start where you are, and this is no different. If you are giving 0.001% of your income right now, then start with 0.002 or 1%, and then grow to 2%. Start where you are and grow incrementally. No one expects that someone is going to go from giving nothing to 10% right off the bat. The next thing I want you to know about financial generosity is that we should give of ourselves first. Our act of financial generosity, our tithe, our gift to the church, should be the first thing off the top. And that's because it is about priorities. But when you give first, when you give those first fruits as part of your tithe, then the rest of your budget falls in line with that. And so our tithes and our gifts should be the first thing we do with our budget every month or every week or however often it is, so that we are building everything else around that practice of generosity. And then the final thing that I want to say is that expect that this is a practice you are going to have to work at. This comes naturally to very, very few people. And like I said, I think this is the hardest spiritual discipline that we have because it takes rearranging literally everything else about our lives around this practice of learning to trust God, learning to love others in this tangible way, more even sometimes than we love ourselves. And so this is a practice. This is going to take forming a habit. It's going to be uncomfortable sometimes. It's going to be frustrating. But I think it's in those things, when we struggle through them, when we remain faithful to that discipline, that's where the transformation begins with us. That's where we start to see God creeping into those cracks that are created by this practice in the way that we have everything held together on our own, when we have to learn to trust instead. So that's my practical advice. Now, in a couple weeks, you're going to get a letter from the church that is your pledge. Since we're not meeting in person, it won't be a matter of getting a card in the bulletin and bringing it up to the altar. You're going to get a letter in the mail. And in that letter is going to be a statement that's going to have a little bit of information about what your financial giving has been in the past year to the church, to help you make decisions about what level of financial generosity you're going to practice in the coming year. In that letter is also going to be a way for you to commit yourself to one or more spiritual disciplines. And there's also going to be a way for you to indicate how you would like to use your talents, your skills more in the church, how you would like to serve more. And there actually are spaces for multiple family members on those letters. And so you'll have the opportunity then to mail it back or to bring it the next time that we have drive-in communion. So be looking for that in your mailbox. But even before it arrives, I want to ask you to be praying over it, to be thinking about how God is calling you to step into greater levels of generosity. I'm proud of the work that is happening in this church. I have a sense that God is working here for transformation, not just of this community, but to use this church community to transform the world around us in ways that we maybe haven't even imagined yet. And so I'm excited about what we're going to be doing in the next year. And I'm excited about all of us being part of that kingdom building work together.